All right, everybody hungry for adventure, welcome back. This is part 3 of the Three Lakes Ranch treasure video, in which I'm going to tell you about my own personal adventures and experiences looking for Montezuma's gold. Now, this is kind of the episode I've been waiting to tell because these are my own experiences, but I'm also going to talk about the experiences of Lon and Brandt Child, the former 2 owners of Three Lakes Ranch. The ranch is now currently owned by a different company, and I'll get into that a little later, but for now I just wanted to give you this sort of recent history of all the crazy things that have happened on Three Lakes. As we've talked about before, Montezuma supposedly got his treasure north, and Freddie Crystal was around Kanab looking for all of these treasures, and even the Dillmans found the map and the stone that led to Three Lakes Ranch. Well, I'm going to talk about why the Three Lakes itself, and the lake specifically, that supposedly has the tunnel with the gold inside, where all that comes from. I'm going to give you the whole history of the Child, as well as my own story. This story is found in the book that I wrote about Three Lakes Ranch, which I don't even know if you can buy this anymore on Amazon, but what you can do is get the PDF on my Patreon, or at least, you know, that's where you can see it, and it's all in color, and maybe you should check it out. Links in the bio and in the description, and like and subscribe and all that YouTuber stuff. Anyway, back to the treasure. Here's the deal. As I talked about in the first episode, I grew up not thinking that treasure hunting was really a thing you could do nowadays. I thought it was a thing of movies, of books, of television, of stories, but not of real life. I had grown up. I realized that real life was a little bit more boring than the things you see in movies, and I was ready to be responsible and get a job and go to college and do all the things that you do in real life because treasure hunting doesn't exist, until a fateful day in 2014. I talked about this in the first episode, but I was on my way to my friend's apartment, and I happened to see an article that talked about treasure hunters in Utah. All at once, it kind of hit me, my paradigm shift, and I realized, wait a second, are there people that are doing this out there? Are there people that are treasure hunting? That was my very first treasure. That was the first one that I looked for. And that was the beginning of everything. Montezuma's treasure, Three Lakes Ranch, was one that came shortly after. It was actually my friend Landon Newton, who I go on many of these adventures with, that brought it up to me first. Since then, I've looked for treasures in England and Ireland and Scotland, Ukraine, Germany, France, Switzerland, Iceland, Guatemala, Peru, Colombia. To me, a treasure isn't always gold. It's stories, myths, legends, the unknown, things that are still out there to be explored. And all of this started in 2014. So I have 10 years of treasure hunting under my belt. And so Montezuma's treasure specifically, that later became, in my mind, the treasure of Three Lakes Ranch, all started when Landon and I saw some documentaries. In those documentaries, we heard about Three Lakes Ranch, and we heard about Lon Child, the owner. So we decided to call him. It was one of the craziest moments of our life, hearing this man who we had seen on the History Channel answer the phone and agree to meet with us. That started this relationship where I began recording the stories of Lon Child. Right around this time is when he was getting kicked out of the ranch because his father had passed away and his siblings had all decided to sell it. This was a point of contention between Lon and his siblings, not something I'm going to personally get into, but I do want to express my condolences to Lon, who had to move off of a place that he loved dearly. We'll get into all that later, but I just want to say the first moments of listening to Lon Child in person talk about his experiences was incredible. This wasn't some loony dude. This was a very down-to-earth construction worker / farmer who at first wanted nothing to do with the treasure legends. He actually called them a bunch of hooey and totally bogus, his actual words. And I must admit that I never planned on writing a book. This was actually an accident. I said I wanted to write a book so that I could interview Lon. And I don't know if he knows this or if he's going to find out by watching this video, but fortunately, over the years, Lon and I have become very good friends. We still talk today, and I actually want to interview him for a podcast on this channel. But I just can't describe the feeling of sitting there, feeling like I was on the path to a treasure myself. And so I'll get to Lon's stories in a second, the ones that he actually told me in person. But before that, I want to talk about Lon's father, Brandt, because the beginning of the Three Lakes treasure really starts with him. In fact, I went with Lon. I drove down to Kanab with him to locate this old record of his father's. It was typed out from a typewriter. We think that his second wife, Venice Child, is the one that actually typed it out. It took a while sifting through old pieces of paper and records, but we finally found it. And I included the thing in its entirety in my book. There are 125 entries of things that happened at Three Lakes before Lon even came onto the scene. Things only Brandt Child did before he tragically passed away in 2002. Of these 125 objects, I'm not going to hit every single one. You'll have to get the book for that. But I'm going to hit the main ones. And this all starts back in the early 80s when Brandt Child first became aware of the treasure legend of Kanab, Utah. His friend Dale White was the one who gave him an audio recording of the story of Freddie Crystal. And in the words of Brandt Child, I was bit by the gold bug. He went with Dale White to the Freddie Crystal diggings up Johnson Canyons, the one I mentioned. And at that point, he was hopelessly in love with the legend of Montezuma's gold. Now, the next entry talks about Brandt Child finding an article in National Geographic that talked about the Aztec water trap. Now, I have tried for years to locate this article. I don't know if it's real or even if it exists, or maybe it was a different magazine, but Brandt talks about it all the time. He said that the Aztecs used to either drain a lake or find an area that they could fill up. They would dig a tunnel and hide their gold and then fill the lake over 35 feet because a person couldn't dive that deep back then. This Aztec water trap legend popped up a whole bunch as I was researching Three Lakes Ranch. If somebody has heard of this entry or this article in the National Geographic, please send it my way. I've been searching for this thing and I don't know if it exists, but if it does, I freaking want to read it. Nevertheless, it was this specific article that made Brandt Child first realize, oh, there are lakes in the area. Maybe it's buried under one of those. Brandt came to his own conclusions that Three Lakes would be the place for this. No one before had looked at Three Lakes as the potential location of the treasure. Even though some people had searched certain lakes in the area, he was the first one to look at that ranch specifically. At the time, a man named Dale Clarkson owned Three Lakes Ranch. This was before Brandt had purchased it, and he actually paid Dale $1,200 to be able to go and explore this lake that he was certain held the treasure of Montezuma. Now, Brandt Child had a family friend, who was also his lawyer, named Tony Thurber. Tony actually paid for half of the $1,200 to be able to explore the lake, and being an avid scuba diver himself, Tony was the very first one to search for the cave. On that very first scuba dive, on the cliff where it meets the lake, Tony Thurber went in and realized it went back very deep. He said that when he got down there, he could see a clear tunnel in the sandstone, and that above that tunnel there was a symbol carved that was Aztec in origin. Now, there's no picture of this symbol or description of it. This is only something that is reported in these records. Lon told me that his father, Brandt, probably told him what the symbol was, but that he had forgotten. Tony Thurber supposedly did enter the cave and made it 60 feet in before he was hit with intense vertigo, as he called it. Scuba divers experiencing interesting things in this tunnel will show up later, so stay tuned. After that, Tony realized he couldn't do this alone, and he got Doyle Hawes involved to be a second diver. Doyle Hawes shows up in a lot of the documentaries because he is the one who had the most dives on Three Lakes. Tony and Doyle also made it into the tunnel, but this time the algal bloom was kicked up too much and they couldn't see anything. It was so dark that their lights couldn't even see a hand placed in front of their face, and they had to leave it alone. Because of that, Brandt decided that he would kill the algae, so he drove up to Salt Lake and purchased some algicide. There's actually a funny little story of at night when he threw the algicide into the lake. There were apparently a bunch of teenagers skinny dipping. There's a legend that Three Lakes was bottomless and that there was a monster in it. So when the teenagers heard that algicide smack the surface of the water, they hightailed it out of there. Tony Thurber later came back with a whole slew of professional divers from Dive Utah, Inc. They all checked out the lake and saw that it was only 30 feet deep and thought it was no big deal. They'd have everything checked out lickety-split. But they also only made it about 60 feet back into the cave before also becoming incredibly disoriented. This team, however, did bring sonar and metal detecting equipment into the cave, and found out that it was actually 300 feet deep, and that at the end of it, there was a significant amount of metal. This was obviously something of incredible excitement, but they knew they couldn't go through the cave with traditional scuba diving equipment. They decided they needed to be able to communicate while under there, so they wanted to come back with what's called a dry suit that has an intercom unit so that they could talk to each other. As they were going back into the cave and they were connecting the umbilical cord to the dry suit, the connectors for the cord were lost. They were never found. Brandt couldn't find them. They hadn't fallen into the lake. They simply weren't there. Therefore, they also couldn't make it past that 60-foot mark. The next attempt, they brought extra connectors. They had the dry suits. They were ready to go. In fact, Brandt Child wrote that one of the divers said, "Today is the day, I can feel it." I've had that feeling too looking for treasures. It's not always the case that you're going to find what you're looking for if you feel that way. But it's a good feeling to have. So with their new connectors, these divers made it into the cave and passed the 60-foot mark. That diver in the dry suit was communicating with the people back on the boat, and past that 60-foot mark, something interesting happened. In fact, something downright spooky. This professional diver that thought it was no big deal, that had done this a million times, that had checked out much more dangerous places than a small lake and a tunnel, shouted out, "I'm being attacked. I'm being choked. I can't breathe. Get me out of here." Frantically, the men hauled him out, and he was, as they say, white as a ghost. The other divers laughed at him for this. He was being dramatic. But one by one, as they went into the cave, the exact same thing happened to them. Shaken and afraid, these 4 divers packed up everything, looked at Brandt Child, and said, "Never call us again to dive this lake. This lake is haunted." And even a year later, when Brandt Child called them to see if they would reconsider, they said, "We do not want to have anything to do with that lake." So Brandt Child realized maybe diving it wasn't going to work. He didn't know if something metaphysical was going on. He didn't know if there were ghosts involved. What he did know is that there was an enormous amount of gold at the end of that tunnel, and he was going to get it. So he thought about potentially draining the lake, something that he couldn't get permission to do because he didn't own the land. So the subsequent move was Brandt Child, who was a businessman in his own right, bought the 450 acres of Three Lakes Ranch so that he could do whatever he wanted with it. Well, it turned out that wasn't the case, because shortly after purchasing the lake, a man named Larry England showed up. Larry England represented the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he told Brandt Child that there was actually an endangered species that lived in that lake, the Kanab amber snail. Now, the amber snail is rare. It only exists in a couple places on the Colorado River and in the Grand Canyon, but apparently this specific subspecies of amber snail lived at Three Lakes and nowhere else on the planet. And if any of these snails, which are smaller than a human thumbnail, were found dead, Brandt would be fined $50,000 for each of them. At that point, the government tried to buy the property by offering Brandt much lower than it was worth. They tried to pressure him into selling it by telling him that there was no way he could ever develop the land with an endangered species there. There was no way that would happen, and he might as well sell it. In fact, the pressure got so bad that Brandt hired a lawyer to fight back against the government because of their injustice towards it. The lawsuit was either going to force the government to pay him what the land was worth or make him leave him alone. And though that lawsuit wasn't successful, it did capture the attention of the entire nation. Reader's Digest wrote an article about how unfairly Brandt was being treated, and it gained national attention. Enough attention that they did start leaving Brandt alone, but told him he better not drain that lake or else they would come back and fine him. So, now that that plan was out of the way, Brandt really only had one choice. He was going to blow it all up. I don't know how that was a better option than draining the lake. I feel like dynamite would also damage the amber snail, but since it was up on the cliff face away from the lake, maybe he thought he could get away with it. In the record of Brandt Child, it's actually called the dynamite period, so apparently there was quite a bit of it. But the interesting thing about this is that the sandstone itself seemed to be undynamiteable. Every time that Brandt, who was an experienced miner, every time that he tried to put the dynamite in and tamp it down correctly, it wouldn't have blown the sandstone away. Instead, it shot the dynamite out like a cannon. This was supposedly exceptionally strange, especially to people who had used dynamite before. And in fact, this also got Brandt in a little bit of trouble, so he had to mostly do his dynamite when people weren't looking. Nevertheless, this was also an ineffective strategy. In the record, it says either it seemed like it was made of a type of rubber that would just absorb the shock, or as soon as they blasted the rock away, the next day they come back and it seemed like nothing had changed, like it was growing back in place. Now, this is, of course, things in Brandt's record that he personally said, and so I don't know if they're true, but they are strange, to say the least. So, after trying all of these different things, Brandt decided to go back to trying to dive the cave. Maybe he just needed somebody braver, somebody a little more ballsy, somebody who was crazy enough to go inside, and that person was known as Timberwolf. Apparently this was his actual name. I don't know if they spelt it correctly, but the way that it appears in my book is the way that it appeared in Brandt Child's record. I wasn't able to find Timberwolf and interview him. Lon told me that he probably wouldn't be interested in something like that, but if Timberwolf, you're still alive, you're living in Salt Lake City and you want to talk, I'd love to interview you about Three Lakes. Timberwolf did in fact make it past the 60-foot mark, at least that's what he said. He apparently made it hundreds of feet back in the tunnel and found that the tunnel branched into different ways, and those ways were sealed up. Brandt says, according to our research, the Aztecs would block up those other tunnels. I don't know if that's true, but we did see similar things up Johnson Canyon with Freddie Crystal's famously Indian-sealed cave. It turns out that the tunnel was perhaps a maze of tunnels, and Timberwolf didn't want to get lost in there. So he came out and inserted a 100-foot-long PVC pipe into the cave, all the way in, so that it would be easier to find in the future. There's also a story about Timberwolf bringing one of his friends to Three Lakes, ones that had extrasensory perception. This person stood on the cliff over the lake and then turned to Brandt and said, "There are hundreds of corpses below me." Apparently this person had some sort of ability where they could sense corpses. Again, I don't know if it's true, but it's an interesting part of the story. Brandt decided that these corpses were Aztec warriors who had ritualistically killed themselves in order to protect this treasure in the afterlife. These were the same ghostly figures that had haunted the divers before, and the same entities that were perhaps keeping Brandt from finding the treasure at all. So Timberwolf left, and a new diver, Steve Schaefer, came in. This is where Brandt Child's record ends. It says, "Enter Steve Schaefer," and then nothing is written below that. Unfortunately, Brandt Child was killed in a car accident in the year 2002, tragically so. It sounds like he had so many more adventures ahead of him when this happened, and so I'd like to dedicate this episode to you, Brandt. Thank you for inspiring adventure in all of us, and for giving that to your children and to people like us who might not be descendants of your blood, but are perhaps descendants of your work. So now let's get to Lon Child's stories, the stories he told me himself sitting across the couch from me. I still have the original audio recordings of his stories, and maybe I'll put them up on my Patreon as well. They are found in my treasure hunting book, the majority of them, but I'm going to tell you the main interesting things that he shared with me. Now, Lon was hired after Timberwolf and Steve Schaefer. After that era was kind of done, Brandt had a brand new plan. He decided, if I can't dive in, if I can't drain the lake, if I can't blow through the side of the cliff, I'm going to dig down through the top. Lon Child had worked in construction. Brandt told him he would give Lon a 10-acre plot of property if Lon came down to help him dig. This wasn't the first time that Brandt had asked Lon to help him out. Lon had helped him in gold mines in Nevada and mining claims up in Bountiful as well. That's why at this moment, when Brandt Child was talking about the treasure of Three Lakes, Lon said it was a bunch of hooey and totally bogus. But when I asked Lon Child what changed his opinion on that, what convinced him of the treasure, he said the very first thing was the first experience he had working for his dad. They had some incredibly sensitive equipment that could go down hundreds of feet, and the tunnels were about 80 feet below the surface, which is where the lake was as well. So yeah, they're on top of the cliff, the lake's below, and the tunnel's underneath. So they're trying to detect straight down. And as Lon walks up to the work site, the metal detectorist, the man there that Brandt had hired, said, "The weirdest thing just happened to me." He said, "See that rock over there? I saw a Native American in full Indian garb just standing there, holding a spear, looking at me." And Lon said, "Yeah, right, that didn't happen." And the guy said, "Hey man, I think this is as weird as anything else, but I tell you, I looked up there and he was there. I looked away, and when I looked back, he was gone. I swear that's what happened." Lon was obviously skeptical of this, but the treasure in general he was less skeptical of when that detectorist looked down and said, "Oh yeah, there's massive amounts of metal down there." Lon said he saw the dial ping all the way over to 100 when he was searching for what was beneath. And when he asked the man, "What do you think's down there?" the man joked and said, "I don't know, maybe a Volkswagen." So, given that evidence, Lon and Brandt brought in a well driller. This well driller was going to drill a 4-inch hole all the way down 80 feet into the cavern. Now, you should know that on Three Lakes, there are a lot of attempted holes and a lot of drill bits stuck in there, including a $15,000 diamond drill bit that Lon had tried himself to get to the cave with. This well driller, however, used his 4-inch hole and bored all the way down and broke through into the tunnel. Lon says as soon as they broke through, there was a sort of depressurization, and that on the lake they could see bubbles come out that proved that the lake and the tunnels, the cavern, were connected. And Lon says this was something he could not believe his own eyes. But when they pulled the drill bit back up, there were gold flakes on it. So all of the men ran to get a small camera and a light on it, and they lowered it down into this cavern and looked around. Lon says that on the video they could see a statue of a person right next to a pile of something. When I said, "Lon, what do you think that pile was?" he said, "I suppose it was gold." So at that point, they tried to do a larger drill bit that was 10 inches and a lot of others, and they kept getting stuck, and they turned in for the day, and the well driller went home and died. That very night, the night they broke through into the tunnel, the well driller went home and had a heart attack. Lon said he was a young guy in his 40s, and that he hadn't had health problems like this before. That was the first bit where Lon started to suspect maybe there was something to this curse of the Aztecs, but he was still determined to help his dad find whatever gold was down there. They decided that a 4-inch and a 10-inch hole just wasn't enough, so they were going to bring a rat holer in, something that would create a hole that was big enough that a human themselves could go down into this cavern. Before they did that, they needed to clear a space for it, and Lon, with his experience in construction, brought his cat all the way down from Bountiful to help rip that out of there and create that flat space. So he attached what's called a shank ripper to his cat, which had a penetrating tooth, something that was many times more hard and sharp than a normal tooth. And Lon said he went through those things so quickly. Somehow the sandstone, which should normally be some of the softest stone, was harder than any material he had ever worked with. And then after days of work ripping out that hard material, Lon came to use his cat in the middle of winter and found the entire engine filled with sand. To this day, it's still inexplicable. Maybe it was a neighborly dispute that Brandt was having with cave lakes right down the road, or maybe it was the curse of the Aztecs. Either way, it cost Lon $30,000 to rebuild his engine, and at that point, he was a little disillusioned with helping his dad out. It wasn't long after that Lon's father, Brandt, tragically died in his car accident. Now, there are a couple stories that happen after this, but it seems like Lon's taste for the treasure, his zest for the gold, it kind of did die with his father, unfortunately. When I met Lon, he was adamant that nobody would come searching for the treasure, that nobody would do any good by looking for it. I suspect that Lon believes his father's death maybe had something to do with the curse. I know that would certainly put a bad taste in my mouth if that happened, and Lon really wasn't interested in anybody searching for the treasure. After Brandt's death, there were a couple of attempts to go for it. A man named Wilf Blum did come in to dive for the treasure afterwards. Wilf was actually an established wreck diver who had hours and hours of experience navigating dangerous situations underwater. When Wilf got to the bottom, he discovered that the entrance to the cave was completely buried. The city had recently put in a water line, and the debitage from that construction had risen the bottom level of the lake by 5 to 10 feet. Unfortunately, it was completely covered, and at that point, he couldn't even find the entrance. And that very night after Wilf Blum left, Lon says the curse struck again, because the room in which him and his wife, Child, were staying was full of propane, to the point where it almost asphyxiated them. Mel happened to wake up in the middle of the night to get them out, but it was close, and they barely made it. And Wilf wasn't the only one that begged Lon to have a crack at the treasure. There was a team that came out with ground-penetrating radar, and Lon begrudgingly obliged to let them come onto the lake. There was a laborer who was pulling it across the ground and a tech looking at the laptop readings. Lon said he was looking at the readings with the tech, and as soon as the laborer hit the spot where he began to see the shape of the cave, the man doubled over in pain and just started vomiting, and he vomited, and he vomited. And Lon said, "Hey guy, are you okay? We need to take you to the hospital." And he said, "No, I'm healthy as an ox. This'll pass. I never get sick." But he continued vomiting and retching on the ground to the point where Lon said, "We're taking you." They took him to the hospital, and the man soon went into a coma. The doctors were legitimately concerned for him and called for his wife just in case he wasn't going to make it. Well, a week later, the man inexplicably was completely and 100% fine, and also never ever wanted anything to do with Three Lakes ever again. These couple of events had convinced Lon Child that he shouldn't let anybody endanger themselves by looking for this treasure. He, of course, had certain interviews for History Channel and different documentaries. You may have seen some of those, but besides that, Lon just wasn't going to let anybody on there. And it was shortly after that Lon's siblings decided to sell the land and kicked him off of it. Lon had been taking care of that land for a very long time, and it was a very, very bitter thing for him to leave this place that his father, Brandt Child, wanted to keep in the family. He had written a record that said, "I want this place to be a place of refuge and resort for my descendants forever." It was difficult to see Lon lose the place that he loved so very much. I don't know all the elements of that story, and I'm not going to go into that, but when I met Lon, it was right as those things were happening, and I actually helped him find the record of his dad, move things out of his house to his new house in Payson, and then he moved again back to Bountiful. One of the things that makes this kind of sad is that Lon had an entire business plan built up to turn Three Lakes into a resort. There are other places in the area like Cave Lakes and Moki Cave, which are tourist attractions, and Lon wanted to do that with Three Lakes Ranch. In fact, there was an entire museum that his father, Brandt Child, had created with little models of Aztecs and Montezuma and legends about Freddie Crystal. It was actually a really cool place. It doesn't exist there anymore, but I got to see this half-dilapidated museum before Lon was forced to move. Hopefully someday Lon can find an investor that can help him turn this place into a resort. They were going to have horseback riding and cabins and water sports and via ferratas and rock climbing. It really sounded like a good idea, so if you're loaded and you have millions of dollars, talk to Lon Child. Now we're approaching the end of this series on Three Lakes Ranch. These are the most in-depth, longest videos I've ever made, so if you stuck around this long, you're awesome. There are so many more stories that I learned about Three Lakes, things that I would love to tell you, I just don't have the time. But I do talk about them in my book. One of the things involves a very interesting chapter of the story that concerns a satanic church from the 70s. You wouldn't think that those things would be related, but in actually my own journeyings, researching all this stuff, I found myself in Stuhl in the Yucatan Peninsula tracking down the traces of this organization, and they became very important to the Three Lakes Ranch story. I won't give more away, you can read my book to learn about that, but it has to do with the current owners of the ranch, that much I can say. Intrigue, rituals, Mayan mythology, a treasure trek that went over decades, this is all stuff that you can find in my book, and maybe I'll make a video about it in the future. But before I sign off, I do want to say one thing. I do want to say that my fascination with Three Lakes Ranch has been so much more than the worth of gold could ever be. Picking apart this treasure story and exploring it like I have has been so rewarding in its own right. But I do want to say right now that somehow along the way, just because I was interested in this, I kind of became the leading expert on Three Lakes Ranch. I accidentally wrote a book. I found myself falling into this role just because I said yes to a crazy adventure. And there are opportunities like that in life. There are things that will become spectacular pillars of your identity if you just say yes, if you just give in a little bit to that adventure. Answer the call. Go out and find the unknown. Thank you for listening to my very, very long 3-part series on Three Lakes Ranch. I hope it was illuminating. I love you guys so much. I can't tell you how grateful I am for every single one of you. I just want to bring a little more adventure and magic to the world and convince you that there are things out there waiting for you to discover them. There are elements in this world that are still on the misty corners of the map. And maybe you're the person that's supposed to go into those misty corners, into the unknown, and see what's there. And I can tell you that when you do, a lot of it's going to be pretty outlandish.